Feminism has always been an extreme movement that rarely, if ever, had anything whatsoever to do with the desires of ordinary women, let alone ordinary men. The greatest progress of the current year is that the mainstream society is slowly but surely starting to see what the non-feminist community has been aware of for over 100 years. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, let me read you a longish quote to back up the statement in the intro. Quote, "Feminism, or as it is sometimes called the emancipation of woman, as we know it in the present day, may be justifiably indicted as a gigantic fraud. A fraud in its general aim and a fraud alike in its methods of controversy and in its practical tactics. It is through and through disingenuous and dishonest. Modern feminism has always professed to be a movement for political and social equality between the sexes. The claim for this equalizing of position and rights in modern society is logically based upon the assumption of an essential equality in natural ability between the sexes. As to this, we have indicted in the preceding pages on broad lines the groupings for regarding the foregoing assumption as false. But quite apart from this question, I contend that fraudulent nature of the present movement can readily be seen by showing it to be not merely based on false grounds, but directly and consciously fraudulent in its pretensions. It uniformly professes to aim at the placing of the sexes on a footing of social and political equality. A very little inquiry into its concrete demands suffices to show that its aim, so far from being equality, is the very reverse, namely to bring about, with the aid of men themselves, as embodied in the forces of the state, a female ascendancy and the consolidation and extension of already existing female privileges. That this is so may be seen in general by the constant conjunction of political and sentimental feminism in the same persons. It may be seen more particularly in detail in the specific demands of feminists. Other results of the inequality between the sexes so effectively urged by present-day feminism may be seen in the conduct of magistrates, judges and juries in our courts, civil and criminal. As regards the disparity in punishment, however, we have an apt and recent illustration in the execution of the youth of 19 convicted on doubtful evidence of the murder of his sweetheart and the reprieve of the woman convicted on her own admission of the murder of her paramour by soaking him in paraffin during his sleep and setting him alight." Close quote. This text was written by Ernest Belfort Bax, a leftist, mind you, in the book The Fraud of Feminism, first published in 1913, 104 years ago. But for the interests of this talk, another quote from the same chapter of the same book is relevant. You see, feminism has always been terroristic, or willing to ally itself with terrorists, and has always banked on the state being cucked to death and afraid to act. And the tactic always worked, and will continue to work until enough people realize that this is a terrorist movement meant to keep everyone mentally hostage through manipulation. And the stakes are much higher today than in 1913. But anyway, before getting to present day, let me read you another long quote about female violence, feminist whining, and feminist terrorists in 1913. So, quote, "Another effect of the influence of sentimental feminism is seen in the crimes of the unwritten law description, the crime passionnel of the French. The most atrocious and dastardly murders and other crimes of violence are condoned and even glorified if they can but be covered by the excuse that they are dictated by a desire to avenge a woman's honor or to enable her to obtain the object of her wishes. The indictment of Sir J. M. Barrie's play of the lady who murders a man by throwing him out of a railway carriage over a dispute respecting the opening of a window and gets acquitted on the excuse that her little girl had got a cold represents a not exaggerated picture of modern justice, for women only. The outrageous application of the principles, if such you may call them, of sentimental feminism in this country in the case of the suffragettes has made English justice and penal administrations the laughing stock of the world. But the way in which the crimes of the suffragettes have been dealt with is, after all, only a slight exaggeration of the immunity from all the severer penalties of the law enjoyed by female convicts generally. This has been carried in the case of suffrage criminals to the utmost limits of absurdity. In fact, the deference exhibited towards these deliberate perpetrators of crimes of wanton destruction is sometimes comic, as in the case of the Richmond magistrate who rebuked the policeman witness in an arson charge for omitting the miss in referring to one of the female prisoners in the dock, as well as in the high character usually attributed to the perpetrators of these deeds of outrage and violence, even by certain functionaries of church and state. They did not speak in this strain more betoken, when mere male anarchists or Fenians were involved in difficulties with the law due to overzeal for their cause. The whole movement, it is quite evident, depends for its success largely at least on the apathy of men. The bulk of men undoubtedly do not sympathize with the pretensions of the feminist agitation, but the bulk of men are indifferent one way or the other. They do not take the feminist movement seriously. The bare notion of women as such being a danger to men as such strikes them as absurd. They do not realize that the question is not of the physical strength of women as women, but of the whole forces of the state being at the disposal of women to set in motion to gratify their whims and passions. The idea of a sex war in which women take the field against men, such as represents the inwardness of the whole feminist movement of today, seems to them ridiculous. The feeling at the root of most men's good-humored patronage of or indifference to modern feminist claims is roughly expressed in the remark of the late William Morris in replying to some animadversions of mine on the subject. What does it matter? A man ought to be always able to deal with a woman if necessary. Why, I could tackle a half-dozen women at once for that matter. This is a common attitude of mind on the subject among otherwise sane and sensible men. The absurdity of it is manifest when one considered that the issue of man versus woman as units of physical strength respectively is purely irrelevant. It is not a question of the man tackling the woman or any number of women. It is the question of the whole force of the state tackling the man in favor of the woman. The prevalent idea in many men's minds seems to be that the state drawing a ring fence around the disputant man and woman and letting them fight the matter out between themselves, which, to speak the language of the great geometer of antiquity, is absurd. Modern feminism, tacking itself onto an older tradition which it travestites beyond all recognition, has succeeded in affecting modern public opinion with an overpowering sense of the sacrosanctity of human femality as such. It is not content with respect for the ideal of good womanhood, but it would fain place on a pedestal the mere fact of femalehood in itself. This is illustrated in 1,000 ways. Thus public opinion tolerates the most bestial and infamous forms of corporal punishment for men in Gauls. It will regard the slight chastisement by the medical head of an institution for mental cases of a girl who is admittedly obstinate and refractory rather than mentally afflicted in the ordinary sense of the term as degrading. Again, in order to sustain its favorite thesis, the intellectual equality of woman with man, it resorts, whenever a plausible case presents itself, to its usual policy of the falsification of fact. One point should not be lost sight of, and that is the attitude of the press. Almost all journals are ready to publish any argument in favor of the suffrage or of the other claims of the movement on behalf of women. In defiance of this fact, a prominent feminist prelate some time ago in a letter to the Times alleged, among other so-called grievances of women at the present day, and apparently as in some sort of condoning of militancy, that the press was closed to women anxious to air their grievances. A statement more directly the reverse of the truth could hardly have been made. Open any paper of general circulation, say any of the morning dailies, and you will find letters galore advocating the feminist side of the question. According to my observation, there are in the proportion of something like 3 or 4 in favor to 1 against. The fact is useless denying that this sex agitation has every favor shown it by current public opinion, including even that of its opponents. Female militants of the suffrage have pleas urged in condoning of their criminal acts, such as their alleged high character, which would be laughed at in the case of men, and yet they whine at being boycotted. Close quote. Now, if you replace suffragist with leftist feminists and suffrage with free tampons or whatever feminist issue of today, and give the quote without the author and the year, 9 out of 10 people, including most feminists, would swear it was written yesterday, because feminism never changed. There was never a moment in history when such absurdity as good feminism ever existed. Feminism has always been the same: supremacist, misandrist, rife with double standards, and willing to team up with legit terrorists to achieve its goals. In 1913, they would refuse equal responsibility under the law, namely to serve in the military. They only wanted the equal outcome, namely the vote, but without the corroborating responsibility. Today, they want equal outcome in terms of average wages, but outright disregard the fair solution, which is to take equal responsibility and work on average the same as men do. So with that in mind, let's get back to present day, 104 years later after Belfort wrote the quotes I read to you, and 91 years after Belfort Bax died of blood poisoning in a London nursing home. On January the 21st, the current year, we assisted to a spectacle of muscle flexing in agitation and propaganda using feminism to recruit useful idiots. Now, I covered that already in a very detailed video, which I advise you to watch if you haven't done so already, because I will make references to things explained in that video. Well, a few days from now, on the Bolshevik holiday of March 8th, and yes, International Women's Day is absolutely a Bolshevik holiday, the powers that be want a new muscle flexing in agitprop. And just like the last time, it will be written about in the cathedral media as being a grassroots effort by women to oppose Donald Trump. And just like the last time, it won't be a grassroots effort, but it will be nastier than the previous time. In January, they only had one radical Islam fan, Linda Sarsour, in their crew. This time, they're bringing the Maoists, the Stalinists, the convicted terrorists, the whole 9 yards. Think I'm joking? Let me read you a very good article from the New York Post. Meet the terrorist behind the next Women's March. And it goes like this, quote, "Here's the left's next great idea for bringing down President Trump, another Women's March, which means another public instance of Trump haters shouting slogans to one another and mistaking it for constructive politics. What progressives need to defend Trump is outreach, but all they have is outrage." On March 8, organizers seem to be aiming for a different vibe than the librarians in pussy hats elements that made the first Women's March after Trump's inauguration so adorable. Instead of miling around Washington, organizers have in mind a general strike called the Day Without a Woman. In a manifesto published in The Guardian on February the 6th, the brains behind the movement are calling for, quote, "a new wave of militant feminist struggle," close quote. That's right, militant, not peaceful. The document was co-authored amongst others by Rasmea Youssef Odeh, a convicted terrorist. Odeh, a Palestinian, was convicted in Israel in 1970 for her part in 2 terrorist bombings, one of which killed 2 students while they were shopping for groceries. She spent 10 years in prison for her crimes. She then managed to become a US citizen in 2004 by lying about her past. Great detective work, INS. Next time use Google. But was subsequently convicted in 2014 of my immigration fraud for the falsehoods. However, she won the right to a new trial set for this spring by claiming she had been suffering from PTSD at the time she lied on her application. Oh, and in her time as a citizen, she worked for a while as an Obamacare navigator. I'm sure that everyone is really shocked that an Islamist terrorist worked on forwarding one of the most radical policies of the Obama administration. I'm sure you're all shocked to hear that. Anyway, you can see why she's a hero to the left. Another co-author, Angela Davis, is a Stalinist professor and longtime supporter of the Black Panthers. Davis is best known for being acquitted in a 1972 trial after 3 guns she bought were used in a courtroom shootout that resulted in the death of a judge. She's celebrated by going to Cuba. A third co-author, Titi Bhattacharya, praised Maoism in an essay for the International Socialist Review, noting that Maoists are, quote, on the terrorist list of the US State Department, Canada, and the European Union, which she called an indication that, quote, Maoists are back in the news and by all accounts they are fighting against all the right people, close quote. You know you're dealing with extremism when someone admits to hating Canada. Now, this lady, mind you, is not some nobody. She's a professor at Purdue University, and as Rishab informed me, you remember Rishab, don't you? This lady is from the Bengal region of India, one of India's literal factory of commies. On her page on Purdue University, we get to read the following, quote, Professor Bhattacharya teaches courses in South Asian history, colonialism, critical theory, and histories of the dead and the undead. Despite her use of Marxism as a theoretical tool and her commitment to complete human liberation, at home Dr. Bhattacharya is forced to live a life of complete servitude to her cat. So, an Indian crazy Maoist cat lady who also teaches at the university. Yet, I'm the extremist when I say the academia needs to be allowed to die because there's nothing to reform without a complete purge. Anyway, back to the article. Quote, the International Women's Strike is meant to be a grassroots affair, with womensmarch.com promising more information about how to participate in local protests across the US. Women around the country are being urged to walk off their jobs and join a demonstration near them. According to The Guardian piece, women should spend their day, quote, blocking roads, bridges, and squares, abstaining from domestic care and sex work, close quote, and boycotting pro-Trump businesses. Also, every woman is supposed to wear red in solidarity. The bristling tone of the manifesto and its call for a militant uprising are yet another indicator that liberals are increasingly willing to justify violence in the name of opposing Trump. After the Berkeley campus erupted in flames and violence to protest the planned appearance of Milo Yiannopoulos, many progressive activists took to Twitter to cheer them on. Hollywood stars Deborah Messing and Sarah Silverman both tweeted their support, with Messing saying, "Resistance works," and Silverman ranting, "Wake up and join the resistance. Once the military is with us, fascists get overthrown. Mad King and his handlers go bye-bye." Progs are equally enthusiastic about the idea that it's okay to punch people as long as you hate them. Stranger Things star David Harbour said at the Screen Actors Guild Awards, quote, "We will, as per Chief Jim Hopper, the character he played on the show, punch some people in the face when they seek to destroy the weak and the disenfranchised and the marginalized," close quote. Nice liberal Democrats should be aware that this newer, angrier cohort is just as hostile to their own party. I have problems with the Democratic Party that is just as linked to the corporate capitalist structure as the Republican Party, Davis said at a rally last year. Anti-Trump activism seems to have little to do with the political arts required to win elections, finding common ground, forging alliances, making friends. Instead, all of these demonstrations are about denouncing enemies and making yourself feel better about the November defeat by gathering publicly with those who share your rage. This sort of thinking leads to self-defeating acts as interrupting traffic in places like New York City, where Trump got 18% of the vote, or San Francisco, where he got 9%. And this is where the author is wrong. You see, the purpose of this kind of agitation, just like it was 104 years ago when Belfort Box was writing, is not to find common grounds, make friends, or forge alliances. The purpose of feminist agitation is terror per se. The good news is that unlike 1913, information is much more easily available and the demands much more ridiculous than in 1913, so the odds of success are severely stacked against their favor, possibly for the first time in history, unlike in 1913 when they enjoyed full and free reign. I mean, that's why they hate the alternative media, because it actively and successfully prevents the free reign that the feminist left has taken for granted for over 100 years. The key here is to never cede even a half of inch of legitimacy to any of this. This is not a legitimate protest, it's sedition and terrorism. If you talk with anyone about this, don't mince words. Call it what it is, a large-scale agitprop operation for seditious purposes organized by communists and terrorists. There are two things feminists hate the most: laughter and being recognized as what they are instead of what they want to be recognized as. So for the low-level activists, the treatment is laughter. Dismiss them outright and mock them mercilessly. For the mid-level and top-tier activists, as well as the operation as a whole, recognize it for what it is and characterize it as such. These are honest-to-God communists teaming up with Islamists to conduct agitprop against a mainstream society that would never, under any circumstances, back them up if they had known what they're up to. Which is why everyone watching this video should make sure to let at least one fellow soul know about the reality behind this grassroots effort to protest Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump. These are the radicals for whom the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. I'll probably have to come back on this topic at a later date, but this is basically the result of ignoring the huge cancer that resides in the universities, or at least downplaying it as if it is no big deal. No, it is a big deal. And mind you, these freaks have the vice chair of the Democrat Party on their side. Keith Ellison is on board with everything the convicted terrorist Razmia Youssef Odeh stands for, including the whole 9 yards of misogyny, anti-Semitism, legit fag hatred, and all the rest brought to you by the religion of pieces. That is why the left must be crushed, and that is why I advised everyone to document every single known activist in your community and keep track of them. Anyway, I will soon publish a few more practical politics videos on this crap, on this crap and this track keeping of extremist leftists, because this needs to become the norm amongst actual people. But until then, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.